At 5:27 in the morning, security cameras captured a quiet suburban street in Frederick, Colorado. Nothing looked unusual, no screaming, no panic, no signs that one of the most horrifying family crimes in modern American history had just taken place. A white work truck slowly backed into a driveway. A man loaded something into the vehicle, then drove away before sunrise. Hours later, he would stand in front of television cameras pretending to beg for the safe return of his missing family. But detectives watching those interviews noticed something disturbing almost immediately. His words sounded correct, but his emotions did not. Because while the world believed Chris Watts was a terrified husband searching for his wife and daughters, investigators were already beginning to suspect something far darker. Behind the smiling Facebook photos, behind the family vacations, behind the image of the perfect suburban father, a secret life had been growing quietly for months. Affairs, financial collapse, emotional detachment, and eventually, a decision so monstrous that even experienced investigators struggled to comprehend it. This is the story of how Chris Watts murdered his entire family, and then tried convincing the world he was innocent. From the outside, Chris and Shanann Watts looked like the definition of the modern American dream. A beautiful suburban home, two young daughters, a third child on the way. Social media videos filled with smiles, birthday parties, vacations, and family moments. Shanann Watts was outgoing, energetic, and highly active online. She frequently shared videos of family life. Viewers watched the couple joke together, celebrate milestones, raise their daughters. To outsiders, Chris Watts appeared quiet, reserved, passive, the kind of man neighbors barely noticed. And that made what happened next even more terrifying. Because many people who later reviewed the case kept asking the same question. How does someone appear so normal, while hiding something so horrific underneath? But behind the scenes, serious problems had already begun developing. Financial pressure, marriage tension, emotional distance, and perhaps most importantly, Chris Watts had started living a second life. By the summer of 2018, Chris Watts was involved in an affair with a coworker named Nicole Kessinger. The relationship changed him dramatically. Friends later noticed he became emotionally distant, more focused on fitness and appearance, increasingly detached from family responsibilities, and unusually cold toward Shanann. Meanwhile, Shanann appeared confused and emotionally devastated. Text messages later revealed she sensed something was deeply wrong. She questioned Chris repeatedly, asked if he still loved her, asked whether another woman existed. At times, Chris reassured her that other moments, he became emotionally unavailable. But according to investigators, while Shanann was trying to save the marriage, Chris was already imagining an entirely different future. One without his family. In the early morning hours of August 13, 2018, Shanann returned home from a business trip. Security footage later showed her entering the house around 1:48 a.m. She would never leave alive. What exactly happened inside the Watts home that morning remains horrifying. According to Chris's later confession, he and Shanann argued after she returned. But investigators would later question how truthful many parts of his story actually were. What is known is that sometime before sunrise, Shanann Watts was dead. And soon afterward, Chris Watts loaded her body into his work truck. But the nightmare did not end there. Because Bella and Celeste Watts were still alive, the details surrounding what happened to the children became some of the most disturbing elements of the entire investigation. Even experienced detectives struggled emotionally while discussing it. By afternoon, friends became alarmed when Shanann stopped responding to calls and messages. One friend in particular, Nicole Atkinson, immediately sensed something was wrong. She contacted police, and very quickly, the entire case began unraveling. When officers arrived at the Watts home, Chris appeared calm, too calm. Investigators later noted several strange behaviors. Lack of urgency, inconsistent emotional reactions, awkward body language, and unusual concern about certain details. Then police reviewed neighbor surveillance footage, and something changed instantly. As Chris watched himself loading the truck that morning, His anxiety became visible. Detectives noticed it. The neighbor noticed it. Even viewers years later would notice it. The image of the innocent, worried husband was already starting to collapse. Soon afterward, Chris Watts gave a television interview outside his home. He pleaded for Shanann and the girls to come back. But millions of people who later watched that footage noticed something deeply unsettling. He smiled at strange moments, displayed almost no visible panic, spoke mechanically, avoided emotional language. To many viewers, the performance felt wrong. Investigators were thinking the same thing. Because experienced detectives often pay close attention to what suspects do not say. And Chris Watts never sounded like a desperate father terrified for his missing children. He sounded like a man attempting to appear concerned. That difference would become critical. As evidence mounted, police brought Chris Watts in for questioning. At first, he denied everything. But investigators already had surveillance footage, phone records, inconsistencies in timelines, witness statements, and growing psychological suspicion. Then came one of the most famous moments in modern true crime history. Chris agreed to take a polygraph examination. The examiner later told him directly, "You did not pass." At that moment, the psychological pressure began crushing the carefully controlled image Chris had maintained. Detectives confronted him aggressively, and eventually, he broke. But even then, his first confession shocked investigators. Chris initially claimed Shanann had killed the children, and that he killed Shanann afterward in rage. Investigators immediately doubted the story, because evidence did not support it. And slowly, the truth became even darker. Investigators eventually discovered where Chris had taken the bodies. An oil field owned by Anadarko Petroleum. The location horrified even veteran law enforcement officers. Shanann's body had been buried in a shallow grave. Bella and Celeste were found inside separate oil tanks. The details devastated the public. But one element haunted people more than almost anything else. According to later reports, Bella may have understood something terrible was happening. The emotional horror surrounding the children transformed the case from national headline into cultural trauma. People across the country struggled to understand how a father could commit such acts against his own family. And investigators kept returning to the same terrifying question. Was this planned? Or had Chris Watts psychologically detached from reality entirely? As detectives dug deeper into Chris Watts' psychology, more disturbing details emerged. Financial problems, debt, emotional resentment, a growing obsession with starting over. Text messages revealed increasing emotional distance between Chris and Shanann. Meanwhile, his relationship with Nicole Kessinger intensified. Investigators later believed Chris had become consumed by the fantasy of an entirely new life. A life without responsibilities, without financial pressure, without marriage, without children. That possibility terrified many people following the case. Because Chris Watts did not fit the stereotypical image of a violent criminal. He looked ordinary, and that made the case feel even more disturbing. The Watts case exploded across social media. Millions of people watched. Body cam footage, interrogation videos, family Facebook clips, news interviews, and psychological breakdowns. Unlike many crimes, this case unfolded almost publicly in real time. Viewers could see the lies, the manipulation, the emotional contradictions. And the moment investigators realized Chris Watts was hiding something, the internet became obsessed with analyzing every expression, every sentence, every movement. Why? Because the case triggered one of humanity's deepest fears. The fear that someone can live beside you, smile beside you, love beside you, and still hide unimaginable darkness. Eventually, Chris Watts pleaded guilty to avoid the death penalty. He was sentenced to multiple life sentences without parole. But even after conviction, public fascination never disappeared. People continued debating his psychology, his motives, whether warning signs existed, and how someone seemingly ordinary became capable of annihilating his own family. Some experts described Chris Watts as emotionally detached. Others pointed toward narcissism. Others believed he simply wanted escape at any cost. But regardless of theory, one truth remained unavoidable. Shanann Watts, Bella Watts, Celeste Watts, and unborn baby Nico never came home. Today, Chris Watts remains one of the most infamous family annihilators in modern American history. But years later, people still return to the case for one reason. Not because they understand it, but because they cannot. Because nothing about the story feels emotionally logical. A smiling father, a suburban home, children laughing in Facebook videos, and underneath it all, a hidden psychological collapse quietly building toward catastrophe. The Watts case shattered the illusion that evil always looks obvious. Sometimes, it looks ordinary. Sometimes, it smiles for cameras. And sometimes, it stands outside its own house pretending to search for the very people it already destroyed. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe to True Crime Story Vault for more disturbing investigations, psychological crime stories, interrogation breakdowns, hidden family secrets, and dark true crime documentaries. And remember, sometimes the most terrifying monsters look exactly like everyone else.